Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you will find a chair and one that you're comfortable in, one that you can hear where your location, we'll get underway. My name is Talmadge Heflin. I'm the director of the Center for Fiscal Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we're really pleased that you're here today. We have a good panel today to talk about relieving Texas' tax burden. And the panel will address, hopefully, the what kind of tax system do you need to provide the essential services of government? And I think where we begin to have difference of opinion is that word essential, or the two words essential services. We find that the panel will be a unique panel if we don't have some difference on opinion of what essential service means. It seems to me, regardless of what the makeup of your legislature is here in Texas, that as long as you have money, nearly everything that you mention is essential. It's only when the money begins to get short that you'll begin to prioritize and say, well, maybe this is not essential, or maybe this is essential. I hope we'll be able to see what essential means in the area of state government. We're pleased that we're able to have some, what I call homegrown economists or Texas economists to talk about the condition of the state's tax system, what it ought to look like in the future. I'm going to introduce the panel in the beginning, and then you come up one after the other. Let me point out our timekeeper. Would you raise your hand, please? Okay. The timekeeper is one person that you can focus on. I know you tend to want to look in the back of the room after that 5-minute signal goes up. She'll give a 5-minute, a 2-minute, a 1-minute, sit down. Of course, she'll be a little kinder than that. But, we're going to give each one of you about 13 minutes. And then we will have some time at the end to talk about what you want to talk about by you interjecting your questions. As soon as we get through with the presentations, I'd like to give the panel a moment or two to question each other if there is a need to, if there's a need for clarification, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A from the audience. We have Dr. Michael Stroop, a professor of economics at Stephen F. Austin University. And he has authored, are you okay? You're not going to fall off? Good. Yeah. I know you're from Texas Tech. I was at a conference one time, and a gentleman from A&M was there to present a certificate to me, but before he presented it, he kept backing his chair up. And next thing we knew, he was on his back and his head behind the podium, behind the stage. We didn't want that to happen again. I'm good. Okay. Pardon me for interrupting the introduction of Dr. Stroop. He'll, I think, discuss his research related to comparing different state tax systems and to show that possibly a consumption tax may be better or give you better results than an income tax. Then we have Dr. Michael Giberson, who will talk about transportation funding and infrastructure. Dr. Giberson is on the faculty in the area of energy, economics, and law with Texas Tech University at Rawls College of Business, and he teaches on energy policy, energy economics, and business economics. We're looking forward to hearing those comments. Then we have Dr. Vance again with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He is an economist with a center, and he was an author, is an author, was a teacher, an analyst, and he has, along with the other two gentlemen, has published a number of papers, and he graduated with honors from Texas Tech and also received his PhD from Texas Tech before coming to work for us. And actually, Dr. Ginn interned with us, and we didn't know it, but he had decided that he was going to go to work for the foundation. and lo and behold, he did. Yeah. We're very pleased to have Dr. Ginn. We'll go ahead and start with Dr. Stroop.
Well, good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to talk before y'all. And my name's Mike Stroop. I'm from Stephen F. Austin State University, which most people do not know does not reside in Austin, Texas. We're in Nacogdoches. We're closer to the Louisiana border. It is the oldest town in Texas. We have a little bit of a reputation for that. So y'all should come out and visit sometime. It's a pretty quaint, small college town. I think you'd like it. Okay, well, I've been asked to talk. I'm going to do less of a focus on interstate comparisons and talk more about Texas sales taxes, some trends that I've noticed, some ways of looking at it, and then step back a little bit and talk about how it's impacted Texas. So we'll go ahead and kick this off. And as you can see, what I've done is I've taken some information from the Texas State Comptroller's office regarding sales revenues across the state of Texas. If you look at all the Texas sales revenues and break it down into its industries, the Comptroller's office breaks it down into, 14, 16 different industries. And I looked at it historically, and as you can see, the percentages of those industries in terms of actual sales revenues varies across industries. The strong players, you've got the top 7, I think, up there on the board. And you can see that the top players are going to be wholesale, manufacturing, retail, trade, and then substantially lower than that are the next ones in terms of magnitude. You've got mining, oil and gas, construction, utilities, and accommodations. So we can look at what's happening with sales tax revenues. We start with the notion of, okay, if we're looking at how it impacts different industries, what's the industry's share of state total sales? And we can see how that changes over time. Of course, we had a little hiccup there during the Great Recession, but you can see the general trends and how they've been changing. One thing that's interesting is to see that if you look at the dark blue line, that's retail trade. Retail trade sales have been falling somewhat if you were to trend it over the last 10, 11 years. What impacts might that have in terms of that specific industry? So retail has been falling. Wholesale has been coming up a little bit, not much, but coming up a little bit on the trend, 10-year trend there. And the others have been sort of bouncing along in a fairly consistent pattern. Well, it turns out that if you're interested in Texas sales tax revenues, not all industries have the same exposure to the tax rate. So just because they have a larger share of tax revenues doesn't mean that they're necessarily paying a larger share of, because they have a larger share of sales revenues, they're not necessarily paying a larger share of tax revenues. And so the next slide looks at what percent of their revenues are actually exposed to the sales tax rate. And you can see that varies a lot. For example, with accommodations, food services, almost all of their revenues are exposed to the sales tax. If you were to look at wholesale, very, very small percent of their activity, their sales revenues, are exposed to state sales tax. So you can see where you might have an industry that has very high percent of state sales revenues, but has a very low exposure to state sales tax. They're not going to be as large a contributor, perhaps, as to another that has modest state sales revenue share, but very high exposure to state sales tax. So it becomes important to take into account those two aspects. If we're going to look at how different industries are exposed to a tax burden, a sales tax burden, we have to look at those two issues. One, what percent of all sales revenues does that industry represent? And two, what percent of those sales revenues are exposed to the actual sales tax rate? And so you can see here that accommodations has a high level of exposure, wholesale very low level of exposure. So what would make sense is, and that's taking a look at it without the high exposure of hotel accommodations, that just kind of opens up, expands the range a little bit. We get to see some more activity of the exposures. So what's interesting is that you would conclude that over time, yes, the ratio of the industry's sales percentages, the shares of sales, would alter over time. And also, which surprised me a little bit, is that the exposure rates can change a little bit over time as they shift sales from exposed to tax rate type of sales to sales that are not exposed to sales tax. So some are fairly stable. If you look at wholesale and manufacturing, their exposure level is very stable. However, if you were to look at things like mining, oil, and gas, you can see that their exposure rates are pretty volatile. And so there's going to be some variation here. So what I've done is I said, let's look at what would happen if we took the sales share by industry and multiplied it by its exposure rate or its exposure share. And that would tell you on an industry by industry basis which ones are facing a larger and larger burden. It's just something to look at. And we can see what's interesting here is it might reveal some implications about Texas sales tax revenues. One of the implications here is that if you've got a retail sales are sort of the one of the big three in terms of percent of total Texas sales revenues, and its exposure has been fairly constant. You can see that over time, because of their shrinking percent of the total sales generated in Texas, their burden has been falling some. And if you look at the green line at the bottom of that graph, you can see that oil and gas is starting to rise, and that can replace some of the lost revenues that you might see coming from the retail section. How this all plays out is sort of interesting because it gives us two things to look at. One is, how is this tax distribution being shifted across the different industries over time? We can see it's been shifting away from retail sales, shifting towards oil and gas over time. That's interesting in itself. That's information for policymakers. But the other thing to look at is, and there I've opened up the graph a little bit. I took out the very high bar and opened up the vertical axis there to show you some more movement. You can see the green movement with the green line showing oil and gas revenue shares, burdens going upward. We can not only see how the composition is changing over time, the tax burden, how it's allocated across the industries, but now we can also look at the trend in terms of overall. If you add up that tax burden the way I've calculated, if you add it up across all the industries, we can take a look in terms of how much of the total tax revenues that have been collected from sales taxes, what's happening to the overall pressure on the economy from the sales tax burden. And we can see that if you use those numbers the way I've calculated them, it has been declining generally over the last 10, 12 years. Now, the good news is, if all else is equal, if the other tax activities have not changed over that last 10 years, then this decline in the sales tax burden overall is going to be good news for the Texas economy. But that's kind of a big overall, that's a big if. Are all things otherwise being equal over that time period with respect to tax policy? And fortunately, one of the good news pieces from this is, if you were to look at the total tax burden that Texas has extracted from its economy, that is total tax revenues divided by total state GDP. You call that the overall tax burden from all tax sources. If you look at the data, you'll find that Texas has historically, over the last couple of decades, been among the 5 lowest tax burden states over the last 20 years. In other words, the tax revenues extracted have been among the smallest portion of GDP across all 50 states. That's obviously heralded some very good news for prosperity opportunity in Texas. When you create greater economic opportunities, that attracts workers to come into the state. It creates jobs. You always want to see a situation where economic opportunity creates jobs. Those are meaningful jobs, lasting jobs, as opposed to just sort of artificially creating jobs just to manipulate some sort of statistics like the unemployment rate or something like that. So it's been good news, I think, in terms of how there's been less sales tax burden on Texans. And I think since you can also show that we've been lowest overall, among the lowest 5 overall in terms of total tax burden on Texas, that also is going to indicate greater economic opportunities for the state. With that, I think I'm going to relinquish the podium to our next speaker, so I appreciate it.
So good morning. I'm Michael Giberson. I do teach in the business school in the area of energy, economics, and law at Texas Tech University. I'm very pleased to be here and pleased for the invitation to participate this morning. So I do feel a little uncomfortable. I'm going to advocate raising taxes at a TPPF event, but we want to raise the right taxes and you know, in a principled way. But you know, there may be some disagreement on the panel, as Tom would hope for. So fuel taxes serve as sort of a road user fee, and this is an appealing concept for both, as I'll say, equity grounds and on efficiency grounds. Those who use the roads pay for them, and the more you use the roads, the more you pay for them. So it's an appealing sort of idea. And to give sort of a preview here, that revenues are not keeping up with the expenses. The cost of our roads are greater than the money that we're bringing in, and so I'm going to offer some principles both for short-term action and some longer-term thoughts on fuel taxes. I want to endorse this principle put out by a writer at the Tax Foundation. States should aim to use as much as possible user fees and user taxes. If you subsidize roads from general revenues, it creates pressures to increase income or sales taxes, which can be both unfair to non-users and also tend to undermine economic growth. So, user pays is the best way to go about it. And again, this is so just way of background. This is based on data collected from the Comptroller's Office and an excellent website called Texas Transparency, which provides all this information on state spending and tax revenue. So we get the Texas numbers are from the Comptroller's Office. The federal numbers are estimates, mostly based off of what data I could find. So about $2.5 billion in gasoline taxes collected at 20 cents a gallon on gasoline sales in Texas. The federal gasoline tax rate is 18.4 cents a gallon. I guess about 2.2 billion coming in. Diesel revenue a little less than a billion. The Texas excise rate on diesel is the same as for gasoline. The federal excise rate is actually a little higher on diesel. And then there's also a small amount of other fuels taxes collected, liquid petroleum gas, but also, other liquefied gases that are used for fuel. But you can see that's a tiny amount compared to gasoline and diesel. In addition, toll collections, I estimate there are a number of toll authorities, some state and some local entities, estimate about 1.2 billion collected there. Motor vehicle registration fees, another 1.3. All these things can sort of fall into the category of user taxes or user fees associated with roads and transportation in Texas. If we add all this up, about $9 billion in user fee collections in Texas. Now, if we compare that to spending, the total budgets in 2013 for the Texas Department of Transportation and the Department of Motor Vehicles, those cost just under $9 billion. And so it might seem like, well, we're about in balance here, and maybe that's seems reasonable. But this is sort of a misleading picture because, we've got to consider sort of a number of factors. So what happens to the revenue? According to the state constitution, a quarter of the money that comes in under the fuel taxes is actually sent to the school funds. So this gets us away from a user fee kind of principle, unless you think there's some connection between how much you drive and how much you ought to be paying towards education. This is actually, from the beginning of the fuel tax in Texas, 1920, the practice was, back in 1920, to set aside a quarter of the fuel tax for education. Later, in the 1930s, that was put into the state constitution. But this is sort of a holdover from the days when when vehicle ownership, gasoline drive, fueled engines were, seen more as a luxury, and so it was a way of maybe taxing the rich, the people in the 1920s who could own a vehicle, a motor vehicle, to contribute to education. I think the situation's changed quite dramatically since 1920. In addition of that federal money, that's federal revenue collected from gasoline taxes, we only get about 80 to 85% of that sent back to Texas. And historically, Texas has sort of done the worst in terms of getting money back, getting fuel tax money back for transportation projects in the state. Many states actually get more money back from fuel taxes than they pay. Texas consistently gets about the least back from the federal government in terms of fuel taxes that come back to the state. In addition, our current spending level is probably not enough. So an assessment conducted a couple of years ago, the 2030 committee projected, for example, that they thought Texas needed about $14 billion spent annually in order just to provide the roads that we need to foster efficient transportation in the state. The Texas Department of Transportation estimates that the state's 100 most congested roads impose costs of about $3.2 billion annually on users. And so, it's suggested that our road building, our road maintenance efforts aren't keeping up with demand. Gasoline taxes were last increased in Texas in 1991, I believe. Since that time, the number of drivers in the state's up by almost 5 million. Lane miles have increased. Vehicle miles traveled has increased nearly 50% since 1991 in Texas. And the fuel economy has improved by about 15%, which means that for every mile you drive, if you drive in a more efficient, you're paying less towards in fuel taxes for each mile. Also, as because of inflation, that 20 cents a gallon as the tax was set in 1981 has declined in value by about 30% as well. So we're bringing in much less per mile traveled than we used to. So these two principles I want to emphasize, equity and efficiency. Equity, the idea that people who use the road should pay for them. And efficiency from an economist's point of view, we want to match the private cost of using the resource to the social cost. So again, we want to fund roads primarily from taxes or fees directed at drivers, not from sales taxes or general revenue sources. From an efficient point of view, the incremental wear and tear on roads when you drive, and also when you have demand for new roads, those are where you want to, those are costs that you want to direct towards the users. There's also congestion and pollution and other external costs that are part of the social cost of driving. Here's the state constitution that directs us to send our net revenues from the motor fuel tax to the available school fund. On the efficiency, on these external costs associated with driving, economists frequently urge sort of raising fuel taxes because of these external factors. I've cited one source here, but it's a fairly common idea in economics. I'm going to argue against it just on the grounds that in a big state like Texas, policies that are based on average externalities will be just wrong about everywhere, right? So there's a lot of congestion cost for drivers in Houston, in Dallas-Fort Worth area, in Austin, San Antonio. We don't have so much problem with congestion in Lubbock. And so if we raise the state gasoline tax because of congestion, some of the time in more urbanized areas, you're going to penalize people in West Texas for driving around. That's not a user fee kind of principle. It's not getting the price right. And it turns out that there are better policy tools when it comes to the ideas like congestion, some of these other external costs. For example, hot lanes, toll roads, localized sort of time-dependent congestion charges. These other policy tools can do a better job of putting the cost where the on the users that are driving those costs. So stick to the user fee concept and address these sort of other sorts of costs, these external costs in other ways. So I present up here that a 33.7 cents per gallon tax in 2014 would be about the equivalent of a 20 cent per gallon tax in 1991, just because of the loss of value of the dollar due to inflation. I'm not recommending that, I'm not saying that 33.7 cents is the right tax now, I'm just for comparison. But if we're going to have tax revenues that cover the needs, the infrastructure needs, we're going to have to raise the gasoline tax. We may also consider indexing fuel tax for inflation so the real value of the tax doesn't decline over time. On the other hand, maybe we just let the tax decline over time and make the legislature make the hard choices when needed to raise the tax as spending requires, as opposed to just accumulating a larger and larger pool of money, which will get spent. Make them think about it each year as inflation comes along. We may also consider urging support of federal gasoline tax reforms. There are proposals circulating now in Congress that would significantly reduce the federal tax and invite sort of states to increase their taxes in return, and basically keep the money more in the states where it's generated, and not sending that money on a round trip to Washington, D.C., which we see not so much that comes back. There are some longer run concerns on the horizon in fuel taxes. As cars get more and more efficient, they're using less gasoline per mile, and so a fuel tax brings in less revenue per mile driven. In addition, there are cars, electric vehicles and hybrid cars. that avoid exposure to fuel taxes either entirely or in part. And so there you have users on the road contributing to the cost, but under our current system, not really contributing to the revenues to cover those costs. And both these trends are expected to continue. The improved fuel economy, a more diverse range of vehicles on the road, increasingly we see, natural gas vehicles, compressed natural gas vehicles. We want to make sure that all the users are contributing to the revenues necessary to cover the cost for the infrastructure. An interesting idea sort of on the horizon is a vehicle miles traveled charge, which would pretty explicitly, the more you drive, the more you pay. Under current systems, I mean, the technology is possible. You can put devices on vehicles that track them and measure how far they travel. There's concerns about privacy, right? If your car is being tracked wherever it goes, so the state can charge you a tax, then the state is, knows where you go. And on privacy grounds, some people may object to that idea. Also, of course, the questions of how you collect the tax, how you enforce it. One relatively convenient thing about a gasoline tax is that it's reasonably easy to collect it at the pump. If you're just based on your annual change in your odometer, once a year you've got to write a check to the state. That's going to be a much more complicated system to collect. So we've got to find a way to make a vehicle miles traveled tax relatively easy to collect. The alternative is we do something to reinforce the existing fuel tax system, raise the current fuel tax as fuel economy tends to change over time, and then create some alternative road use fees for electric vehicles and for hybrids. And that's, thank you.
There it is. All right. Good morning. So as Talmadge said, I did intern at the Texas Public Policy Foundation in the summer of 2011, and I emailed them so many times afterwards that they finally hired me, which was a good thing. Finished my PhD last May from Texas Tech University. So I'm pleased to be here and with all of you. So today I'd like to talk about a paper that Talmadge and I published recently on the STAR Fund, the Sales Tax Relief Fund, as a way to protect Texas taxpayers and to provide tax relief to all Texans. So just a little bit of economic, what's going on in the economy of Texas. One thing we know is Texas has been growing by leaps and bounds. In 2012, Texas grew by 5.5%. In 2013, grew by 3.7%, which was the fastest out of the top largest 5 states across the nation, and it was considerably faster than the personal income growth across the United States. So we see substantial economic growth, and what we like to say a large part of that is from the entrepreneurial spirit that's alive and well in Texas from the Texas model, right, of no income taxes, having low taxes, modest government spending, and stable regulations that help to fuel the fire, if you will, of entrepreneurs and business and employers and allow for all Texans to succeed. All right? And so with this economic growth from our free market sort of economics and our economic classes, economic growth brings about faster job growth. Right? And with faster job growth, this is an annual averages, looking at monthly data going back to 2004. And you'll notice that Texas has led the way, which I've termed the Texas decade, having higher job growth there in the red compared with California in the blue, the dashed line, or the national average there in the shaded gray area. But as you'll see in 2012, late 2012, early 2013, California is catching up, and other states are starting to catch up as far as annual job growth is concerned, which is good. We want all Americans to have more job opportunities, right, and be employed. That allows us to have better livelihood and standard of living. But we also like to be number one in Texas, right? And so one thing we like to do is to see, the sales tax maybe a little bit lower from time to time to allow for more entrepreneurial spirit to thrive. So with this economic growth and more job creation, higher incomes, a recent study by the Dallas Federal Reserve shows that this wasn't just job growth in low-wage jobs, right? It's across the income spectrum that we've seen more job growth and incomes rising. And so with higher incomes and more people having jobs, this brings about more tax revenue. So if you look at sales tax revenue from 08-09 to 14-15, we like to look at these bienniums, right? So sales tax revenue is up 28% since 08-09, and it's been up now for 47 consecutive months, almost 48 or almost 4 years. So we've seen substantial economic growth and more revenue flowing into the state coffers as time marches on. And what we've also seen is not only is sales tax rising, but we know we've had a lot of oil and gas production here in the state, from the Eagle Ford Shale, the Barnett Shale, the Klein Shale, which is going to be it's a new formation, or it's not a new formation, but it's new production that's coming along in the East Permian Basin that will continue to bring about more oil and gas revenue. And part of that oil and gas revenue flows into the state's Economic Stabilization Fund, also known as the Rainy Day Fund, our savings account. And so you'll notice back in 2004-05, the ESF cap that's set by the state's constitution was $7.5 billion, and the amount of revenue that flowed in from oil and gas production was only $1 billion, right? So we had a long way to go to actually reach that cap, but as oil and gas production has expanded, we found these new shale oil plays, fracking, right, all these things. We've seen oil and gas revenues begin to rise substantially. And these are looking at maximum monthly ending balances. And if you look at the report by the Legislative Budget Board, LBB, in April 2013, they showed that the maximum monthly balance for the 14-15 biennium would be $11.8 billion, which reaches very close to the cap of $14.4 billion. Now, there was some money that was dipped in by the legislature this past session to pay for water projects, and the constitutional amendment that will be on this year's ballot to pay for highway projects that reduced this down some to what the comptroller is now saying around $8.1 billion will be left at the end of the 14-15 biennium. But the general trend is up, right? And we're reaching closer and closer to the cap. And so the question becomes, what happens when the day arrives where there's more revenue flowing in than the cap? Currently, those revenues would flow into the general revenue. And as we know, the legislators love to spend that extra revenue. And so what we're saying is maybe there's another avenue, another vehicle, instead of flowing directly in the general revenue, maybe we could provide some tax relief to all Texans. So currently, in the fiscal size up that the LBB reports on the 14-15 fiscal size up shows that the comptroller expects that total revenue will exceed expenditures by $2.6 billion during the current 14-15 biennium. And that was as of the December, her certified revenue estimate. And so we have some time between now and the end of this 14-15 biennium through August 2015. And we know that we live in a dynamic economy. There are many different factors that go into play. So as the economy continues to grow, more jobs being created, revenue continues to rise, this could be as high as $4.1 billion. Right? It's anybody's estimate at this point. So the question is, are Texans taxed too much? Right? And is there another way in the appropriations process to put money back into the hands of taxpayers instead of putting into other programs? And during the appropriations process today, currently, right, it favors interest groups. If let's say $1 million is cut from the Arts Commission or some other commission where you find inefficiencies and waste in a program, well, you'll have those interest groups or rent seekers that would hand out from another program arguing in favor of just redistributing that $1 million to another program. And so it stays within the overall spending metrics and doesn't allow for any sort of cuts or restraint from the growth of spending moving forward. And so what we're really arguing for is to add a vehicle for taxpayers to have a louder voice during this appropriations process. And that's through the STAR Fund, the Sales Tax Relief Fund. So the Sales Tax Relief Fund would be a fund that the legislators should create, hopefully in the 2015 legislative session, which would hopefully will do three things. So it will restrain the size of government, the growth of government, provide tax relief for all Texans, and keep Texas competitive. So the way that it would work is it would be funded in two ways, right? One would be by the Texas legislature during the appropriations process. So as we mentioned, revenue continues to rise, so there will be an incentive for legislators to continue to spend those dollars. And if there's any waste from one program, there's not a vehicle for them to return those dollars to taxpayers. Instead, there's an incentive to spend it on other programs, as I just mentioned. So this way, with the STAR Fund, it will allow them to deposit those funds directly into the STAR Fund instead of another program. Okay? And another way it can be funded is, as I mentioned a minute ago, any flow over of the ESF, the rainy day fund that we have. Any amount that comes in above the constitutional cap, instead of going into general revenue, which legislators will spend, how about allowing the taxpayer to get some of that money back and flow directly into the STAR Fund to provide tax relief. So through this legislation, as we're having this framework in mind, legislators will come up with the details here, but allow the comptroller to have the authority to temporarily lower the state sales tax rate, we're just talking about the state portion, the 6.25%, not the local amount that could be as high as 2%, right? Just the 6.25%. Allow the comptroller to temporarily lower the state sales tax based on the amount that's in the STAR Fund, and then when the STAR Fund, after that certain period that's chosen, after that period, it will automatically revert back to the original amount, right? So what would that look like? Okay, so consider the fiscal year 2013 sales tax revenue that was brought into the state of $25.8 billion. So that means for each cent of the 6.25% state sales tax rate, that brought in $4.1 billion. Okay? So let's say that $4.1 billion was deposited directly into the STAR Fund. What could the comptroller do? The comptroller could lower the state sales tax rate by half a cent from 6.25 to 5.75 for 2 years. Right? That's how much it would take over that 2-year span to exhaust the STAR Fund. And any revenue that's lost in the general revenue fund from having a lower sales tax, well, that money will be replenished by the amount that's in the STAR Fund until it's exhausted. And then after that 2-year period, the sales tax rate will automatically revert back to the 6.25%. So it's a very simple approach, a simple vehicle to provide taxpayers, all taxpayers, with tax relief. So how would it affect the family, right? That's what we really care about. Families and businesses is what this is all about. So this cut from 6.25 to 5.75 is not just a half cent, right? But it's actually an 8% cut in the state sales tax rate. So if you look at the IRS calculations of how much an average family of 4 pays in sales taxes in Fort Worth and in Dallas, you'll notice that with this 8% cut, a Fort Worth family, average family, would save about $118 over this 2-year period. And a Houston family would save about $132 on average. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but every little bit helps whenever you're struggling, or whoever it may be, right, across the Texas economy. For example, you could buy 30 gallons of milk with those dollars, right? 40 gallons of gasoline. So the state sales tax rate, half of the revenue is paid, a little bit more than half is paid by business across the Lone Star State, and a little bit less than half is paid by consumers. So consumers not only benefit to help grow the economy and spend more throughout, and choice of whether to save or spend, but also businesses can save money as well in order to hire more workers or purchase more capital. And purchasing capital allows for more economic growth. The keys to expanding an economy is allowing for more capital and investment to create more productivity, to hire more workers. And finally, it's an economic individual liberty argument, I think, right? It allows for us to have the decision with our own money, hard-earned money, of whether to spend or save, right? Each of those extra dollars allows you to save a little bit more to put back for an emergency that may come about, or whatever those individuals may choose to spend their money on or save, right? Which they currently don't have today. So we also heard from Dr. Stroop's presentation earlier that a sales tax is preferable over an income tax if you look at comparing different states, which I know you've done some research on that as well. And so one way in order to help us to continue to be competitive is to keep the state sales tax rate lower, right? Recently, the Tax Foundation released a report showing that Texas's state sales tax rate is the 11th highest in the nation. And so one way to bring us lower in that, we don't want to be highest, right? We want to be one of the lowest and still pay for essential services, as Talmadge mentioned earlier. One way to do that would be to lower the state sales tax rate over a certain period of time and allow for more economic growth in a dynamic economy that continues to increase in efficiency and productivity, as we saw earlier from the economic growth and the job growth that we've had in the Lone Star State. So this changes the dynamics of the appropriation process, where in fact, if legislators decide not to deposit money in the STAR fund, this is like, not voting. This is voting for a tax increase or voting against tax relief, to put it that way, right? And it's simple to administer. Some say, well, how would you administer this? But we already see this with a payroll tax holiday on the back-to-school shopping, right? That they drop the sales tax rate down to zero. So there's already just a few buttons that you have to push in order to adjust the rate. And if it's over a long enough period, this leads to more economic certainty, okay? We wouldn't want it to continue past that rate or before the rate, or before that time period. It should last until the time period. That way there is economic certainty for businesses to be able to follow. We've seen the damage of uneconomic fiscal policies and uncertainty that brings about from what's going on in D.C. currently, right? With Obamacare and the changes that take place and how that affects businesses. That's not what we're trying to do here. We want certainty in the overall system. So 3 things that I think hopefully you'll take away from with the STAR Fund is we'll restrain the growth of government, provide Texas tax relief to all Texans, and it will keep the Texas economy the envy of all states. So I hope you'll check out texaspolicy.com, where we have our paper, Protecting Texas Taxpayers, and also a couple of other commentaries that we've released over the last week that will explain this more, and you can find out more information. And please contact us if you have any questions. So thank you.
A big thank you to the panelists. Let me take a moment now and see if our panelists have any questions of one another. Did someone say something that you want a clarification on, or just more information? Anybody?
Go ahead. I have some comments, but I'll wait for someone else.
Okay. Do you have any questions? No. Okay. Let's see here. Hello? All right, there it is. I just had a quick question, Dr. Giberson. With raising the gas tax, would that also assume that we're currently spending the right amount? Could there be ways that maybe we could cut on the expenditure side instead of trying to generate more revenue?
Yeah, I didn't present any sort of explanation of I reported the 2030 committee's estimate that we need an average of about $14 billion a year, without going into the details about where the money's already being spent wisely, and that's clearly part of the analysis that would have to be done. I mean, I think that fuel is a good way to raise money for transportation, but you still want to consider whether you need to raise the revenue, right, or whether the money is being well spent. It's also an important part of the analysis, of course.
Thank you.
Great.
Yes, sir. Dr.
I just had a couple comments, one for Dr. Giberson and one's for Dr. Ginn. Dr. Giberson, you talked about your proposal for changing the fuel taxes and the way that they are spent. I've always wondered, my comments are always in terms of, well, how can we make this work? How can we politically implement this in a way that's going to pass through a voting process and such? And one of the slides you had up there talked about how efficiency is a good thing when the people who use it more are the ones that pay for it more. So it makes sense that if you're taxing transportation activities, it should go toward infrastructure promoting transportation activities. That totally makes sense. But then the question becomes, well, a lot of people who think differently than economists have a different version of fairness. And their version of fairness is, well, whoever's more capable of paying more should pay more, regardless of whether they use more of it or not. And sometimes, I think as economists, we forget to think about ways of implementing these efficiency-enhancing ideas in ways that are palatable to people who have alternative views or perspectives on fairness. And so I was thinking, just my comment might be, how can we implement this politically, is to say, well, think about a third party that's not involved in education, that's not involved in transportation. There are other interests. I mean, there's family and protective services. They're worried about young kids and things like that. There's environmentalists who are concerned about quality of the environment. If you can show that increasing the efficiency will create less waste overall in the tax collection system, that's going to free up resources that can be channeled toward other activities that are still very important to people who have a different perception of fairness. And I want to challenge our profession to think more creatively about how to illustrate the opportunity costs of inefficiency in terms that they can relate to, in terms of, diminished objectives in their own particular interests. So that was just a comment more than a question.
I appreciate I appreciate the comment. I often, in discussions with my wife, I tend to support ideas that are efficiency enhancing and explain it about that sensitively. And actually, my wife has a master's degree in economics, so she understands, but she's often feels like, but don't I actually care about helping people? And when I say efficiency enhancing, I think I am saying that I care about helping people, but there's a communication problem there. I agree.
Yeah. And real quickly, a second comment for Dr. Ginn, along the same lines. When you first talked to me about the STAR Fund and the proposal, I mean, it sounds like an amazing opportunity for enhancing efficiency. And I think one of my parts of my comment should be, if we only focus on those few $100s per family that might be refunded, that's really underselling it. I know that's not what your focus was, but if our takeaway from this is, oh, well, the STAR Fund will just give families back a few $100 a year, that's a dramatic underselling, because I really agree with your points how it's going to enhance competitiveness across all those different programs within government. When you start talking about forcing proponents, lobbyists of particular programs to work within a very constrained, very fixed system, you're going to potentially have efficiency enhancements in how those dollars are spent, which are going to be benefits way beyond just a few $100s per family. It's really going to make Texas more competitive in terms of its public spending patterns, and perhaps more of a focus on infrastructure and enhancing productive processes. And again, my question, I guess, is how can we implement this politically? We need to show that there are, right now, there are going to be some parties who feel like that we're kind of losing out on the relative persuasion scale and how much influence we're having. If you can point out that we're going to make this a much more efficient system, we're bringing everybody to bear on the allocation questions, especially the taxpayers, who, last I've heard, the taxpayers haven't hired lobbyists to go to Austin to try to make changes in their favor. So as far as how do we make this happen politically, where's the support coming from? We just need to, again, draw in third parties and show how they might be hurt if this doesn't get implemented in terms of a lack of efficiency and how it spreads around to everybody.
Simply, I agree. I agree with your statements. We'll continue to work on those as well, that's for sure.
Great. All right, do we have a traveling microphone? Okay, we do have one. Have a question here the front, if you'd wait on the mic. It'll be here in a moment.
It's John Merrifield, UT San Antonio. I'll be up on the podium later, so I'll keep this short. I'm curious, with one speaker talking about raising taxes and another one lowering them, it seems to me that if the increase in taxes is a real need, why don't we put the surplus revenue there, especially since much of the transportation need lately is a function of the energy development that's generating those revenues.
Did I get that on? No. Well, again, it's a question of, again, it's a question of a user fee idea. That is, people who are using the roads pay for them. If you just take sales tax revenue, sort of general revenue, and apply it to transportation, people who aren't using the road so much, end up contributing towards transportation.
I was speaking more in terms of the excess ESF number, which is definitely generated by the energy sector.
There's a great deal of activity associated with the development in the energy sector, and a lot of trucks going up and down the roads, and there are additional transportation.
So it's sort of a user fee.
But they're already they're buying their diesel and paying the diesel fuel tax.
That's not enough.
Well, yeah, and that's what my point was. Yeah, that's not enough. We need to raise those. We need to raise those fees exactly on the people who are using the roads, and a sales tax doesn't do that.
And there are some other mechanisms that we've looked at as far as maybe controlling the cost side more, looking at design build as a way to control some of the costs in transportation, and maybe looking at where exactly some of the funds are being diverted and from other areas out of general revenue or out of other funds that should go to transportation instead of having to raise the gas tax at all. So those are other things that we've been looking at the foundation.
Any comment?
I also just want to jump in that when you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it, and when you don't, then you don't get as much of it. What's happening is if we're subsidizing another program through the activities that are generating a different tax, then raising the tax in one area is just simply, I think what in Dr. Gibson's defense, what he's proposing is a more efficient form of collecting the same revenues. So let's make education revenues be driven by something else besides transportation taxes, and let transportation costs that are infrastructure costs, et cetera, be reflective in those taxes. So it's rather than thinking of it in terms of raising a tax, I think in Dr. Gibson's defense, it's more of let's make sure that the prices that we're paying for these public services are more reflective of reality, and therefore get a more efficient outcome.
Question here.
Good morning. I'm Stacy Hawk. Dr. Giberson, I agree with all of the comments you made and certainly support usage tax. I noticed we have a Tesla, so apparently when I'm driving that, I'm not paying my user fees. And I'm curious about the fact that you didn't mention the concept of road tolls or fees that could potentially be varied based on congestion in the areas we talked about, and other sorts of consumption fees that would be directly related to economic, social benefit, and otherwise. So just your thoughts on that. And then also thinking about congestion or needs going forward, do you have any thoughts on autonomous cars playing a factor in that and the efficiency that would have?
So on the autonomous cars, I think there's just a great cool factor there, and I'd love to have one. There are actually also efficiency benefits, right? The more autonomous cars on the road, the more likely safer roads and better driving, right? We all have read those instructions on how you can improve your fuel economy by accelerating more appropriately for the situation. All that, but it's kind of hard to remember all those things. But you can program your car to do that, and then it just does things efficiently. More on, I only briefly mentioned the congestion fees, hot lanes. A hot lane is like a toll road alongside a heavily traveled thoroughfare where you can either take the main highway or you pay the toll and you get on the sort of the express lanes. And when those tolls go to adding lanes, you basically, obviously the people who get on the express lanes travel faster, but also people who, because you've diverted some of the traffic off the main roads, also can travel faster. You get a more efficient, more efficiently flowing system altogether. I think in general, toll roads and sort of time of day specific transportation charges, these are sometimes complicated to implement in our sort of very heavily networked road systems, because people are resistant to the small transaction charges, so they'll try to get around toll roads when they can, even in cases where it might make sense for them to pay the $1, pay the $2, and travel faster. But in general, these are approaches that tend to put the costs on the people who are driving the costs, and so you get resources directed where they're needed, because the toll collections directly support the roads that are being used. I think it's a good system.
We have a question. Okay,
Yes,
one
sir,
here
Matt
and then
Beebe.
down
I
front.
have a question really for Dr. Stroop and Dr. Ginn. Dr. Ginn, you posed the question as to whether Texans are taxed too much, and I guess I'd certainly put myself in the camp that would agree with that. But I think there's a predicate question as to whether or not the current sales tax regime is taxing Texans fairly. And I think that was very interesting to see the relative tax burden across the different industries. And I wonder why there's not more discussion about that, and I wonder if looking at making that more equitable, whatever that is, and I'm not sure it's a flat rate across all industries, is not what we want to move toward. But I wonder if looking at that deeper might be better than just sort of taking the existing regime and dropping the rate slightly, and maybe in affect would be at the retail, where more Texans actually experience the direct impact of the sales tax, they would actually sense more immediate relief if we looked at it that way.
Yeah, you raise a lot of interesting issues in my mind. I was thinking about all these implications. To the extent that we use user fees more in terms of funding other areas like transportation, that would allow for sales tax revenues in general to perhaps be funded toward those activities that generate somewhat equal benefits to all Texans. Public safety, perhaps you could argue education, something like that. So yeah, if you make the prices that Texas taxpayers have to pay for those aspects of public services that you can track usage of, track benefits of better, and focus on user fees there, that will decrease the burden on the overall sales need for general sales taxes to fund generally benefiting programs. And then that would help us, deal with, is the sales tax structure appropriately allocated? First you have to figure out, well, who's getting the benefits from the state services, charge user fees as much as you can in those areas. The broader ones are subject to sales tax, and with the Star Fund coming on, that would put more competition to make sure that amount of sales tax could be minimized, because it's going to be refunded back effectively to the state taxpayers eventually. So I don't know that's a direct answer to your question, but it's kind of what was going through my mind as what are the implications of a sales tax, how can it be used more efficiently, that would be a way to address it.
Dr. Ginn.
So bring up very good points there. Can you all hear me? All right, thanks. Bring up very good points. And one thing that we're trying to do here with the sales tax reduction relief fund is to tax for all Texans, whether it be in businesses or individuals, right? Something we're also focused on, this is more of a short-term goal. Longer-term goals, we're still focused on eliminating the franchise tax, right, which is on businesses. And so we're looking at lowering their cost for businesses there as well. And then longer-term goal also is to eliminate the property taxes. And swap it with a higher sales tax. And so we have a couple of other things that we're still working on. We're thinking here in the meantime, let's find a way to reach all taxpayers, businesses and individuals alike, and that's through the sales tax. Like I said earlier, more than half sales tax revenue is paid by businesses of all types. and then a little bit less than half is paid by individuals. So this affects both. And I know Dr. Strew brought up some good points there with affecting different industries differently, but this also is based on their amount of sales revenue that they are bringing in. The tax that they pay is the same across, right? So, that's kind of our approach here.
We'll take the question back here, then we'll have one on the front row and then one 4 rows back, please.
Bill Worsham. Dr. Giberson, do you have an opinion on vehicle sales taxes as being user fees or not user fees, and kind of can you discuss that? And also, do you consider using fuel taxes to fund transit? Do you consider transit a user? I mean, is fuel taxes devoted to transit a user fee?
So the vehicle sales tax, two ways you can think about it. One is as a retail sale, that if retail sales are taxed, then the vehicle sales tax, may seem like not a user fee, but just going to, well, you've got to raise money for essential services somehow, and to the extent that you can't do it with user fees or user taxes, a vehicle sales tax is a way to collect revenue for the essential services of the government. It's only really sort of falls into a camp of a user fee to the extent that there are some, maybe you call sort of overhead expenses in the licensing of vehicles and tracking, those sorts of things. I think of it more of as the vehicle sales tax as not so much as a user fee, and more just sort of a general revenue rate approach. On transit projects, it's complicated. When I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, which I did for nearly 20 years, I used public transit a lot. It certainly made sense as compared to spending 45 minutes on the roads to make a 15-minute trip. I don't think it's out of the question that out of user fees you could do something towards transit systems, but it takes sort of a more complicated cost-benefit analysis to make sure those things are well spent.
Question here.
Dr. Strew, your chart on the overall sales tax burden over the last 10 years, 2002, 2012, pretty good downward slope. I wondered what it looked like over maybe a 30-year trend. Is there some, can you give us any indication of what you would attribute that downward slope to? And was it downward prior to that time? So is it a general trend based on the economy, or is some political dynamic cause this to happen?
Unfortunately, I did not look at the trend in sales tax revenues and therefore what the total tax burden was prior to that time period. I was just mostly interested in sort of recent history, so I apologize, I can't give you any insights over those prior periods. My personal spin on this is that I think Texas has had more growth, economic growth, than anticipated over the last 10 years, and I think Dr. Ginn's chart kind of showed that. And so from the policymaker standpoint, how that affects tax income, tax revenues, I think, I guess what I'm alluding to is, in the 90s, when we had greater growth overall as a nation than the U.S. Congress anticipated, we actually, our tax revenue, the tax burden overall was lower than what was predicted. So I wonder if these last 10, 12 years, the higher growth than expected relative to where we thought we would be given the Great Recession and everything like that. Maybe that has something to do with explaining why the burden has been somewhat lower the way I've calculated it, and that's one particular way of looking at it. So maybe there's some of that unanticipated economic growth. And remembering, not all revenues are exposed to tax rates across the industries equally. Some industries have very high exposure rates, some industries have very low exposure rates. Wholesale, for example, very, very low exposure rates. So if wholesale sales took off more than we thought, we're not going to see a huge pickup in tax revenues, but we will see a big pickup in Texas GDP, and that would help contribute to what looks like a lower state tax burden. So I think there's some of that going on, but I wouldn't want to make a definitive statement because I haven't taken as comprehensive a look as needed to make a kind of definitive statement like that.
I have a question right here in the fourth row.
Thank you. This sort of applies to everyone. And as our friend back here was talking about equity in the sales tax, is it also equity in who causes the expense that we need to spend the money on? And I'm going to use the highway as an example. I only have Midwestern figures. I've been in Texas long as I have the Texas figures. But in the Midwest, we used to figure one fully loaded truck did the same damage to a road as 9,800 cars. Now, of course, the Midwest has two things that Texas doesn't worry about. It's called winter and salt. But the simple fact is, trucks do a heck of a lot more wear and tear on roads than cars do. And when you're talking about sales tax, whether it's not what you're talking about or what Dr. Gibbons is talking about, is anyone studying the idea of saying that he who causes us an expense should perhaps be helping to pay for more of it? And with the federal tax, gas tax being lower for diesel, you know, unless things are a lot different in Texas, it's those trucks that are beating up the roads, not the cars. I mean, the cars maybe jam them, but the trucks beat them up.
Anybody want to take that on?
In principle, I agree. That the trucks do a lot more damage to the highways than the cars. But it's just a question of, is it possible to design a tax that more closely represents, sort of a true user fee, puts a real price on the roads that's equivalent to the cost. So a vehicle miles traveled adjusted by weight class would be maybe closer to the ideal, and maybe 5-10 years down the road that becomes reasonable. I think it's true. If you're looking at trying to charge people for the wear and tear on the roads, once you build a road that's strong enough for a truck, actually driving a car and doesn't really put much wear and tear on it. The trucks do, and so in terms of who's causing the costs, who's doing the wear and tear, the large trucks are doing much more wear and tear on your highways. So it makes sense. It's just a question of how you design the user fee, design the tax to actually implement that.
As you can see, we have issues that are very complex when you break them down into the minute parts. Unfortunately, our time is coming to a close. We have another panel that starts at 10:15. There are those that think that we've had no surplus in the last several years because there's always a need that someone perceives as a need to spend money on. What we're hoping this discussion will lead to is the legislature being willing to prioritize and come to agreement on what is the appropriate tax structure, and then live within the means of that structure, so that the taxpayer and the economy is not overburdened by taking too much money out of the private economy, so that jobs can be created, people can improve their lives through their work. And so we're hoping that this will just be the beginning of the discussion of some very important issues in that. Our next panel, as I mentioned, will start at 10:15 in this room. So we appreciate you being here today. If you would, help me thank the panel again this morning. So we'll have about a 15-minute break. Thank you.